The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as guard Thomas Mitchell took his position at the main entrance. At 28 years old, Thomas had served the Royal Guard for 6 years, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for what would happen that Tuesday morning in September. The palace was buzzing with activity as usual. Tourists gathered behind the iron gates, cameras ready to capture the famous guards in their red tunics and tall black hats. Thomas stood perfectly still, his rifle held at attention, his face showing no emotion despite the growing crowd of onlookers. Around 10:30, an elderly woman approached the gate. She was probably in her 70s, wearing a faded blue coat and carrying a worn leather suitcase that looked like it had seen decades of travel. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back, and her eyes held a determined gleam that caught Thomas's attention immediately. "Excuse me, young man," she called out in a shaky but clear voice. "I need to speak with someone about this suitcase. It belongs to the royal family, and I've been carrying it for 50 years. The tourists around her began to murmur and pull out their phones. This was certainly more interesting than watching the guards stand motionless. Thomas remained in position, but his training kicked in. Protocol demanded that he not break character, but something about the woman's voice made his heart race. "Please," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and this suitcase contains something that was meant to be returned to the palace long ago. My late husband was a palace servant, and he asked me to bring this here when the time was right." The crowd grew larger as word spread among the tourists. Margaret stood there patiently, the mysterious suitcase at her feet, while Thomas felt sweat beginning to form under his heavy uniform. He had never encountered anything like this during his years of service. A senior guard, Sergeant Williams, noticed the commotion from his position near the palace doors. He began walking toward the gate, his face serious as he assessed the situation. The crowd held its breath, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Margaret looked directly at Thomas, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, Thomas felt something shift inside him. There was something familiar about her face, something that made his stomach tighten with an emotion he couldn't identify. "I know this might seem strange," Margaret said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But I made a promise to a dying man 50 years ago. Today is the day I keep that promise." The morning air seemed to grow thicker as more people gathered. Palace staff began appearing at windows, and even some of the other guards glanced over despite their training to remain focused straight ahead. Thomas could feel his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his rifle. Sergeant Williams reached the gate and began speaking quietly with Margaret, but she shook her head firmly. "No, sir. This needs to be done properly in front of witnesses. The contents of this suitcase will shock everyone here, including you." The crowd pressed closer to the gates, smartphones recording every word. Thomas felt as though time was slowing down, each second stretching like an eternity. Something about this woman, about her story, about the suitcase itself, was triggering memories he couldn't quite grasp. As Margaret began to unlock the old brass clasps on the suitcase, Thomas noticed his hands were shaking more violently. The sound of the metal clicking open seemed to echo through the courtyard, and everyone leaned forward in anticipation. "What I'm about to show you," Margaret announced, her voice carrying clearly across the silent crowd, "will change how some of you see the royal family forever. This suitcase contains the truth about something that happened decades ago, something that was meant to stay hidden." Thomas felt his knees beginning to weaken, though he fought to maintain his rigid posture. Whatever was in that suitcase, he somehow knew it would affect him personally. The familiar feeling he had about Margaret was growing stronger, and memories from his childhood were beginning to surface like bubbles rising from the depths of a deep pond. Margaret's weathered hands moved slowly as she opened the suitcase completely. The crowd pressed even closer to the iron gates, holding their breath in collective anticipation. Thomas could see sweat beading on Sergeant Williams's forehead as he tried to maintain control of the situation. Inside the suitcase, nestled in faded silk lining, were several items that made the onlookers gasp audibly. There were old photographs, what appeared to be official documents with royal seals, a small wooden box, and something wrapped in delicate lace that caught the morning sunlight. My husband, Harold Thompson, worked in the palace kitchens for 30 years, Margaret began, her voice growing steadier with each word. He died in 1974, but before he passed, he told me about something he witnessed that changed his life forever. Thomas felt his vision becoming blurry. The woman's voice seemed to be coming from far away, even though she was standing just meters from him. His childhood memories were becoming clearer now, and with them came a flood of emotions he had buried deep inside his heart. Margaret carefully lifted one of the photographs from the suitcase. It was black and white, clearly taken decades earlier, showing a young woman in a simple dress standing next to a man in palace uniform. The woman was holding a baby, and her face was radiant with joy and love. This photograph was taken in 1955, Margaret announced to the captivated crowd. The woman in the picture is my sister, Elizabeth Thompson. The man is Harold, my husband, when he was just 22 years old. And the baby... She paused, looking directly at Thomas. The baby is their son. The world seemed to spin around Thomas as those words hit him like a physical blow. The rifle in his hands felt impossibly heavy, and his legs threatened to give out completely. The crowd was murmuring excitedly, but their voices sounded like they were underwater. Margaret continued, her eyes never leaving Thomas's face. Harold and Elizabeth were secretly married in 1954. She worked as a seamstress for the royal family, and he was in the kitchens. They kept their marriage hidden because palace staff weren't allowed to be married at that time. Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his face pale. Ma'am, I think you need to come with me to speak with palace officials privately. This isn't the appropriate way to handle such claims. But Margaret shook her head firmly. No, sir. This story needs to be told here, now, in front of everyone. Harold made me promise that when the time was right, I would return what belongs to this young man. She pointed directly at Thomas. The crowd turned to look at Thomas, their cameras now focused on him instead of the suitcase. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but all he could see was Margaret's face, and suddenly he knew why she looked familiar. She had the same eyes as his mother, the same gentle curve to her smile. Thomas, Margaret called out, using his name for the first time. The sound of it made him jump slightly. Thomas Mitchell. You were born Thomas Thompson on March 15, 1995, in the small apartment above the palace stables. The crowd erupted in excited whispers. Thomas felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, something that had never happened during his years of service. His hands were shaking so violently now that he had to grip his rifle tighter to keep from dropping it. Margaret reached into the suitcase again and pulled out the wooden box. Your mother, Elizabeth, died when you were just 3 years old. Harold was heartbroken and couldn't bear to raise you alone while working at the palace. He made the most difficult decision of his life. Thomas's memory flashed back to his earliest childhood. He remembered being told that his parents had died in a car accident, that he had no living relatives. He had grown up in foster care, moving from home to home until he was old enough to join the military and eventually the Royal Guard. Harold arranged for you to be adopted by the Mitchell family, Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. He watched you from a distance as you grew up, never interfering, but always making sure you were safe and cared for. He saved every penny he could, hoping that someday you would learn the truth about who you really were. The wooden box in Margaret's hands seemed to glow in the sunlight. Thomas knew that whatever was inside would change his life forever, just as surely as he knew that this moment had been destined to happen since the day he first put on his guard uniform. Around him, the crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, all recording and photographing this extraordinary scene. But Thomas could only focus on Margaret and the box in her hands, waiting to discover the secret his real father had kept hidden for over 2 decades. Margaret opened the wooden box with trembling fingers, revealing contents that made the entire crowd gasp in unison. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were several items that sparkled in the morning light. There was a gold pocket watch, a small stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon, and something that made Thomas's heart stop beating for a moment. It was a silver locket, the same one he remembered seeing in fragments of childhood dreams that he had always dismissed as imagination. The locket was engraved with intricate patterns and had a small photograph visible through its crystal front. "Harold kept this locket after your mother died," Margaret explained, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent courtyard. "She wore it every day, and inside is the only photograph she had of the three of you together as a family." Thomas felt his professional composure completely crumbling. Tears were now flowing freely down his cheeks, something that would normally result in immediate disciplinary action. But Sergeant Williams made no move to intervene, clearly as stunned as everyone else by this unfolding drama. Margaret held up the stack of letters. "These are letters Harold wrote to you every year on your birthday. He never sent them because he felt it would be selfish to disrupt the life you had built. But he wanted you to know that not a single day passed without him thinking about you." The crowd had grown to over 200 people now. Palace staff were gathering at windows and doorways, and Thomas could see security personnel speaking urgently into their radios. But none of that mattered to him anymore. All that existed in his world was this woman who claimed to be his aunt, and the treasures from a past he had never known existed. "But the most important thing," Margaret continued, reaching deeper into the wooden box, "is this." She pulled out a thick envelope sealed with red wax that bore an official-looking stamp. "Harold discovered something during his years working at the palace, something that involves you directly." Thomas's legs finally gave out, and he sank to one knee, still clutching his rifle but no longer able to maintain his rigid posture. The crowd murmured in sympathy and concern, but no one laughed or mocked him. Everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something profound and life-changing. Margaret carefully broke the wax seal on the envelope and pulled out a document that appeared to be some kind of official certificate. As she unfolded it, Thomas could see ornate lettering and what looked like a royal seal at the bottom. Harold was working in the private dining room one evening in 1956 when he overheard a conversation he was never meant to hear, Margaret explained. "Two senior palace officials were discussing a situation involving your mother, Elizabeth." The document in Margaret's hands seemed to glow with importance as she held it up for everyone to see. Thomas could make out some of the writing from his position, but the old-fashioned script was difficult to read from a distance. "Your mother, Elizabeth Thompson, was not just a seamstress," Margaret announced, her voice growing stronger with each revelation. "She was the daughter of Lord William Ashford, a minor member of the royal family who had been disowned for marrying a commoner in the 1930s. The crowd erupted in excited whispers and gasps. Thomas felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting and changing. Everything he had believed about his identity, his background, his place in the world, was being rewritten with each word Margaret spoke. "This document," Margaret continued, holding the certificate higher, "is your mother's true birth certificate showing her royal lineage. When Lord Ashford died in 1955, he left a substantial inheritance specifically for Elizabeth and any children she might have." Thomas's mind reeled as he tried to process this information. Not only did he have living family, not only had his father watched over him from a distance all his life, but apparently he had royal blood running through his veins. Margaret reached into the envelope once more and pulled out another document, this one looking more modern. "Harold spent the last 20 years of his life working with lawyers to track down this inheritance. He wanted to make sure that when you learned the truth, you would also receive what was rightfully yours." The second document appeared to be some kind of legal paper with official stamps and signatures. As Margaret unfolded it completely, Thomas could see numbers written in what looked like financial notation. "Thomas Thompson," Margaret said, her voice now carrying the weight of ceremony, "you are not just a royal guard protecting the palace. You are a descendant of the royal family, and according to this inheritance document, you are now the rightful owner of the Ashford estate, including properties and investments currently valued at over £12 million. The crowd's reaction was immediate and explosive. Cameras flashed continuously, people shouted questions, and the excitement was palpable. But Thomas heard none of it. He was staring at Margaret, his mind completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just revealed. His entire life, Everything he thought he knew about himself had just been turned upside down in the span of a few minutes. And somehow, deep in his heart, he knew that Margaret was telling the absolute truth. The palace courtyard had transformed into chaos as news crews began arriving, having been alerted by the viral social media posts from witnesses. Thomas remained on one knee, his rifle forgotten beside him, staring at Margaret as she continued to reveal the secrets that had been hidden for decades. Sergeant Williams finally approached Thomas, his face showing a mixture of concern and confusion. "Thomas, lad, I think you need to come with me. We need to sort this out properly." But his voice was gentle, lacking the usual military sternness that characterized his commands. Margaret stepped closer to the gates, still holding the inheritance documents. "There's more, Thomas. Harold left detailed instructions about what you should know and what you should do with this information." She reached into the suitcase one final time and pulled out a thick diary bound in worn leather. "This belonged to your mother, Elizabeth. She wrote in it every day from the time she met Harold until just before she died. The last entry is a letter addressed to you." Thomas felt his heart breaking and mending simultaneously. The idea that his mother had left him words, thoughts, and feelings from beyond the grave was almost too much to bear. He struggled to his feet, his legs shaky but determined to hear everything Margaret had to say. "Harold read this diary countless times over the years," Margaret continued. "It helped him understand what Elizabeth would have wanted for you. She dreamed that you would grow up to be strong and honorable, someone who would make a positive difference in the world." The crowd had grown even larger, and Thomas could see reporters pushing through the mass of people, microphones extended and cameras rolling. Palace security was trying to establish some kind of perimeter, but the situation had clearly gotten beyond their normal protocols. Margaret opened the diary to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Your mother wrote this on the day you were born. My beautiful son Thomas came into the world today, and I have never felt such pure love. I pray that whatever happens to Harold and me, Thomas will grow up knowing that he was wanted, that he was cherished, and that he comes from a line of people who served others with dignity and honor." Thomas felt his knees wobbling again, but this time from overwhelming emotion rather than shock. The words his mother had written nearly 30 years ago seemed to reach across time and wrap around his heart like a warm embrace. "She also wrote about her fears," Margaret continued, turning to another marked page. "She was terrified that the royal family would discover your true heritage and try to use it for political purposes. She wanted you to have a normal life, free from the complications that come with royal connections." Sergeant Williams placed a supportive hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Son, regardless of what all this means, you've been an exemplary guard. Whatever comes next, remember that." Margaret looked directly at Thomas again. "Harold's instructions were very specific. He wanted you to have choices. The inheritance is yours by right, but you can claim it or renounce it. The royal heritage is part of your blood, but you can acknowledge it or ignore it. The decision is entirely yours." The diary in Margaret's hands seemed to pulse with the weight of his mother's dreams and fears. Thomas realized that in a few short minutes, he had gone from being an orphan with no family to having an aunt, a substantial inheritance and a connection to royalty that he had never imagined possible. "But there's one more thing," Margaret said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow still carried clearly through the courtyard. "Harold discovered that your mother's royal connection means something significant for your current position." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine as Margaret's expression grew more serious. The crowd seemed to sense that another major revelation was coming, and the noise level dropped as everyone strained to hear her next words. "According to the royal succession laws and the documents Harold uncovered, your position as a royal guard takes on a completely different meaning when you have proven royal bloodline," Margaret explained. "You're not just protecting the royal family, Thomas, you're one of them." The implications of this statement hit Thomas like a thunderbolt. His role at the palace, his sworn oath to protect the crown, his entire career had been built on a foundation he had never understood. He had been guarding his own distant relatives without ever knowing it. Margaret held up one final document from the suitcase. This is a genealogy chart that Harold had professionally researched and verified. It shows your direct line of descent from King George III through your mother's side. You are, technically speaking, a minor member of the royal family yourself. The crowd erupted in the loudest commotion yet. Cameras flashed incessantly, people shouted questions, and the entire scene took on a carnival-like atmosphere. But Thomas felt strangely calm for the first time since Margaret had appeared. The truth, no matter how shocking, was finally setting him free from a lifetime of questions about his identity. As the reality of Margaret's revelation settled over the courtyard, palace officials finally arrived to take control of the unprecedented situation. A senior aide to the royal household, accompanied by two men in expensive suits who were clearly lawyers, approached the gates with serious expressions. "Mrs. Thompson," the senior aide addressed Margaret formally. "I'm Charles Whitmore, Deputy Private Secretary to Her Majesty. I believe we need to discuss these matters in a more private setting." But Margaret shook her head firmly, clutching the genealogy chart to her chest. "Mr. Whitmore, my husband Harold worked for the royal family for 30 years. He knew how things get handled behind closed doors. This needed to be done publicly, with witnesses, so that Thomas would never doubt the truth of his heritage." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that this confrontation between Margaret and the palace officials would determine what happened next. Thomas stood frozen between his duty as a guard and his shock at learning his true identity. Charles Whitmore's face remained diplomatically neutral, but his eyes showed clear concern. "Mrs. Thompson, if these documents are authentic, they represent matters of significant constitutional importance. They cannot be resolved in front of television cameras." Margaret's expression hardened with determination. "These documents have been authenticated by 3 different law firms over the past 20 years. Harold wasn't some confused old man making wild claims. He was methodical, careful, and absolutely certain of every fact he uncovered." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm Robert Sterling from the firm of Sterling, Blackwood & Associates. We've been handling the Ashford estate matters for the past 15 years, waiting for this day when the rightful heir could be located and informed." Thomas felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him as the lawyer addressed him directly. "Mr. Thompson, I have additional documentation in my briefcase that corroborates everything Mrs. Thompson has shared. Your inheritance includes not only financial assets but also 3 properties, including the original Ashford Manor House in the Cotswolds." The magnitude of this information was overwhelming Thomas completely. He had gone to work that morning as Thomas Mitchell, a simple royal guard with no family and modest savings. Now he was being told he was Thomas Thompson, a member of the royal family with an inheritance worth millions. Sergeant Williams stepped protectively closer to Thomas. "Sir, with respect, my guard has been through quite a shock. Perhaps he needs some time to process all of this before any decisions need to be made." Margaret nodded approvingly. Harold anticipated this reaction. That's why he left specific instructions about what should happen next. She reached into the suitcase and pulled out a sealed envelope with Thomas's name written in careful handwriting. "This is Harold's final letter to you, Thomas. He wrote it just 2 weeks before he died when he realized he wouldn't live long enough to see you learn the truth. Everything you need to know about your choices is in here." Thomas accepted the letter with hands that were still trembling. The paper felt substantial and important, and seeing his name written in his father's handwriting was almost too emotional to bear. Charles Whitmore cleared his throat diplomatically. "If I may suggest, perhaps Mr. Thompson would benefit from reading his father's letter in private, and then we can arrange a proper meeting to discuss the implications of these revelations." But the crowd wasn't ready to disperse. People were calling out questions, reporters were trying to push closer, and the entire scene was becoming increasingly chaotic. Margaret looked around at the circus-like atmosphere and made a decision. "Thomas," she called out loudly enough for everyone to hear, "your father's letter gives you 3 choices. You can claim your inheritance and your royal heritage publicly. You can accept the inheritance but keep your royal connection private. Or you can walk away from all of it and continue your life as it was this morning." The crowd fell silent, waiting to see what Thomas would do. He looked down at the letter in his hands, then at Margaret, then at the suitcase full of documents that had turned his world upside down. But there's something else Harold wanted you to know, Margaret continued, her voice growing softer, but still carrying clearly. No matter what you choose, he was proud of the man you became. He watched you grow up from a distance, saw you join the military, saw you become a royal guard. He knew your mother would have been incredibly proud of your character and your service. Thomas felt tears flowing again as he looked around at the crowd, at his fellow guards, at the palace he had sworn to protect. Everything looked the same as it had an hour ago, but everything had changed completely. Margaret closed the suitcase and picked it up, preparing to leave. The choice is yours, Thomas Thompson, but whatever you decide, know that you were loved by parents who made sacrifices to give you the best life possible, and you have family who has been waiting decades to welcome you home. As she turned to walk away, Thomas realized that this moment would define the rest of his life. He could return to his post and pretend this had never happened, or he could step forward into a future he had never imagined possible. Thomas stood in the courtyard holding his father's letter, surrounded by hundreds of strangers who had witnessed the most important moment of his life. The weight of the decision before him felt enormous, but as he looked at Margaret walking away with the suitcase that had held his family's secrets, something inside him shifted. "Wait!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. Margaret stopped and turned back, hope evident in her eyes. The crowd held its breath, cameras focused on Thomas as he made his choice. "I want to read the letter," Thomas announced, "but I want to read it here now with everyone as witnesses. If my father kept this secret for 50 years and you've waited this long to tell me the truth, then I don't want any more secrets." Margaret smiled through tears and nodded approvingly. Charles Whitmore looked uncomfortable but didn't object, apparently recognizing that this situation had moved far beyond normal protocol. Thomas carefully opened the envelope, revealing several pages of handwritten text in his father's careful script. As he began to read aloud, his voice grew stronger and more confident with each word. "My dear son Thomas," he began, "if you are reading this letter, it means Margaret has kept her promise and you finally know the truth about who you are. I pray that learning about your mother and me brings you peace rather than anger." The courtyard was so quiet that even the distant traffic seemed muted. Thomas continued reading as Margaret moved closer to the gates, tears streaming down her face. "I want you to know that giving you up was the hardest decision I ever made, but I believed then, and I believe now, that it was the right choice. Your mother and I were young and unprepared for the complications that your royal heritage would bring. We wanted you to have a chance at a normal, happy life." Thomas paused, looking up at the crowd that hung on his every word. He could see people wiping their eyes, clearly moved by this intimate family moment being shared so publicly. "But I also want you to know," Thomas continued reading, "that I have watched you from a distance your entire life. I was there when you graduated from school, when you joined the military, and when you became a royal guard. I have never been prouder of anyone in my life." Sergeant Williams stepped forward and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture of support. Several of the other guards had also moved closer, forming a protective circle around their colleague as he processed his father's words. "The choice about what to do with your inheritance and your heritage is yours alone," Thomas read. "But I hope you will consider using whatever you decide to keep to help other young people who find themselves alone in the world, as you were. Your mother always said that privilege without purpose is meaningless." Thomas folded the letter carefully and looked around at the faces surrounding him. The crowd, the reporters, the palace officials, his fellow guards, and Margaret all waited to hear what he would say. "50 years ago, my father made a choice based on love and sacrifice," Thomas announced, his voice clear and strong. "Today, I'm going to make a choice based on the same principles." He walked over to where Margaret stood and embraced her, the aunt he had never known he had. The crowd erupted in applause and cheers as they held each other, two family members finally reunited after decades of separation. "I accept my inheritance," Thomas declared, turning back to face the crowd and the cameras. "But I'm going to use it exactly as my father suggested. I'm going to establish a foundation to help young people in foster care, young people who think they have no family and no future." The crowd's response was overwhelming. People were cheering, crying, and calling out words of encouragement and support. Thomas felt a sense of purpose and direction that he had never experienced before. Charles Whitmore stepped forward with a slight smile. "Mr. Thompson, on behalf of the royal household, I believe we can arrange for you to take some leave from your guard duties while you process these developments and handle the legal matters involved." Thomas nodded gratefully, then looked back at Margaret. "I have one more request," he announced. "I want to visit my parents' graves. I want to tell my mother that I understand why she and my father made the choices they did, and I want to thank my father for loving me enough to let me go." Margaret wiped her eyes and smiled. "Harold is buried in the cemetery just outside the village where you were born. I visit him every week, and I've been telling him about you all these years. He'll be so happy to finally meet you properly." As the crowd began to disperse and the reporters rushed off to file their stories, Thomas realized that his life had been forever changed by one elderly woman's determination to keep a 50-year-old promise. He was no longer Thomas Mitchell, the orphaned guard with no family. He was Thomas Thompson, a man with royal blood, substantial inheritance, loving family, and most importantly, a clear purpose for his future. The morning sun was now high overhead, casting different shadows across the palace courtyard. But for Thomas, everything looked brighter and more hopeful than it ever had before. He had started the day protecting the royal family as his duty. He ended it knowing that he was protecting his own distant relatives, and that knowledge filled him with a pride and sense of belonging he had never imagined possible.